So the first one we talked about was what we just mentioned, that debt held by the public. That is when you and I and corporations and governments lend their money to the federal government. And also keep in mind, this works the same way with pretty much every single country. So you can buy government bonds for Spain if you want to invest in that. And that will pay you a interest rate, or pay you an interest rate. You can buy government bonds from Russia, and that will pay you an interest rate. So it's not like the United States is the only country doing this. You can invest in bonds from a lot of different countries. And then the last one, intergovernmental holdings. If you recall, this is the one that doesn't really sit that easy with anybody. That's always my way of describing it. This is where the government lends itself money. So just like a corporation might have a lot of cash on hand, and this is money that they're going to use in the future for some reason, and they want to earn a little bit of interest on it, they will buy bonds with that money, and they'll get paid interest. Well, the government does the same thing. The government has bank accounts, federal government has bank accounts, that they are holding money in for use in the future. So what they do is they'll take that cash and they'll also buy government bonds from themselves, replace whatever cash they have with government bonds, and then those get paid back just like everyone else's. So that's how intergovernmental holding work. So you've got public debt and intergovernmental holdings, add those together, and you have the national debt. Any questions on how that works? All right. And I'm not going to ask you how big the national debt is, because that answer all depends on exactly when you take your quiz, because that number changes every second. But as we know now, it's pretty close to $28 trillion, $26 trillion. A lot of money. All right. Any questions on national debt? All right. Yeah.
So when for intergovernmental holdings, so the government will have a trust fund, and then they will somehow replace the cash there with, and they'll buy more bonds to invest the money into a different program?
Correct.
Okay.
Because if you remember, you have the trust fund. So the perfect example was Social Security. You've got the Social Security Trust Fund. And by definition, the trust fund has to be used for a specific purpose. So the money in that Social Security Trust Fund can only go towards Social Security, nothing else. It can't go towards building more interstates, and it can't go towards defense. It has to go towards that. Now, that there is a large chunk of money, about $2.8 trillion sitting in that account. And the government says, we want to make sure that this earns a little bit of interest, because we're not going to be spending it right now. And we know with inflation, as prices go up, if we just have this money sitting there, it's actually going to lose value. So they said, all right, we're going to go ahead and we want to invest this money. Now, we don't want to invest it in anything crazy like the stock market, because then it might lose value, and that's bad. So we want to invest it somewhere really, really, really safe, where the value won't go down. Where's the safest place to invest your money? In national government debt. So what they're doing is they're taking that money and they're investing it in federal government debt. It just happens to be the same federal government that they are. So that's how they lend themselves money. And like I said, it's not as terribly convoluted as it sounds. It's a little tongue-in-cheek when I make fun of it, but that's what it is. The federal government is lending money to itself. All right, good question. Any other questions? Cool. I think that's 3 questions on your quiz dealing with national debt, if I recall. And we got into GDP. So first we talked about, if we go way back, kind of see the order we're doing this in the class. So first we talked about taxation, which is how the federal government brings in money. And then we added on to this national debt, which is how they bring on money when they engage in deficit spending. So they spend more than they bring in taxes. Where is that extra money going to come from? It's going to come from borrowing. So we see how the federal government brings money in. Now we measure how the output of the economy is. So the full output of the economy. How much stuff are we producing? And that is through GDP. which as we know is gross domestic product. And like I said, the generic kind of definition for this is total output for the country. So this is how much stuff we are creating every year. And if you recall, there was the definition we went through, and each part of that definition is pretty important. And I'm just going to kind of summarize here. So let's move this up a little bit. All right. So GDP is the market value. Which means GDP we talk about in terms of dollars. And the only time you're not talking in terms of dollars is when you're talking about the change in GDP. So change is always measured in the percentage. So you're not going to say the GDP went up $2 billion. You're going to say GDP went up 0.4%. So it's a total market value, all final goods and services. Remember, this is kind of the tricky part. A final good or a final service is something that is not being used to create something else. It's what's being consumed by the end user. So we only count that very, very, very last step of the production process. We don't count each step in between. And the example we gave in class, which I think is a great example, is you look at something like bread. When you and I buy bread, we're going to make sandwiches and eat it, or we're just going to eat it plain, or we're going to roll it up in a ball and throw it at somebody, whatever you might do with bread. So that becomes a final good or service. You're not using it to produce something else that you're going to sell. When Subway and Jimmy John's buys bread, they're using it to create sandwiches that they're then going to sell to their customers. So when they buy bread, that's not a final good. So therefore, that does not get calculated into the GDP. That sandwich does get calculated in the GDP. So that's what I mean by final good or service. Is it being used to produce something else? If not, then we count it. It's final good and final service. So it's market value, all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country. This is another important part. So remember, this is where, not who, or whom. I don't know if it's who or whom. So the focus of GDP is where it's being produced, not who's producing it. So we don't care if it is a Japanese-based corporation that's producing stuff in the United States. If it's produced within the borders of the United States, it's going to go into the US GDP. So if you recall, great example is Toyota. We're all familiar with Toyota. It's a car company. Toyota is a Japanese-based company, but they have 6 manufacturing plants here in the United States. When they manufacture stuff here in the United States, that goes into the US GDP. When Toyota manufactures stuff within Japanese borders, that goes into Japan's GDP. They have a manufacturing plant in England as well. And when they produce stuff in England, when Toyotas are produced in England, that goes into England's GDP. So it all has to do with where it's produced, not who is producing it. And then the last part, we tend to talk about GDP in terms of full year. We look at it quarterly, and those quarters they tend to be estimated numbers. But when you're talking about GDP, you tend to be talking about in a full year. So 2020 GDP was about $20 trillion. It was 19.9 trillion. So it's about $20 trillion. That was our annual GDP for 2020. So remember, it's a very, just like all this stuff, a very specific measurement. So you can always look at something and say, yes, that is counted in the GDP. No, that's not counted in the GDP. So there's your definition. So remember, the definition is a little more complicated than it sounds. Then we talked about things that are not included. So if they're not counted, even though they might be a final good or service produced within a border, there are certain things we don't count. And those are securities, which are stocks and bonds. So any financial transactions are not counted. Gifts. Or you can use that fun term, unilateral transfer. When your birthday comes up, you can thank people for all the generous unilateral transfers that they made to you. That's just a gift. That's when money or something goes one direction, nothing comes back. So you go with gifts. The big one, used goods. The two big examples are houses and cars.
What about if someone took a used good and then made another product from it?
Then it would be an intermediate good. We wouldn't count it anyway because it's not a final good or service because they're making another product out of it.
But would the final product be in the GDP?
Yeah. So if you look at a company like, if you're familiar with Patagonia, clothing company. So they make ugly shirts like this. That's not true. So they make a lot of outdoor gear, a lot of activewear, and they have a whole thing where you can take your old Patagonia clothing and send it back to them, and they actually recycle it and they create new clothing from it. So if that's the case, that when they sell that new clothing, that does become that does go into the GDP. Think of it like recycling. You recycle a can, that can becomes another can of whatever beverage you might like, and they sell that, that goes into the GDP.
Or if you like bought a dress like a wedding dress secondhand and then remade it, that would, and then sold it, it would then be in the GDP.
That would be considered a new good. You've made it. So the way they define this goes well beyond the scope of this course. The way they define it is, have you made a substantial change to the product?
Okay.
So if you go and you cut an inch off the bottom and resell it, that's probably not. But if you go and you chop it up and resew things, I don't know much about wedding dresses. I haven't worn one in a while, so my memory's a little foggy. Yeah, so it's if you made a significant change. There are some gray areas. And and that's where the statistical analysis comes in when they do this. You're never going to get a fully perfect number, but as long as you make the same analysis every year, it's the changes that are important, not the actual number. There are your used goods, houses and cars, and then the last one is illegal transactions. Illegal transactions are not counted in the GDP. And again, all four of those things impact the economy. So don't think it's not like they don't have an impact on the economy. We just don't count them specifically when we're measuring GDP. And then the last thing with GDP is my favorite one. Recession, a term that a lot of people use. In fact, yesterday, I was in a meeting and one of our other faculty, who does not teach economics, because I am the only one that teaches economics, one of our other faculty made mention that we are in a recession, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want the meeting to go any longer than it needed to go. But because I didn't want to go ahead and correct them and be like, we're not in a recession, which is true, but I let it slide. Maybe I'll email it later. No. Remember, the term recession has kind of entered into our language as this generic term for the economy's not doing that well. But we know that the term recession has a very specific, measurable definition. So you can say, yes, we are, or no, we are not in a recession. Remember, it's back to back because I can't spell consecutive. So back-to-back quarters. Remember, a quarter is 3 months. So in the calendar, we look at the quarter as being January, February, March, first quarter, April, May, June, second quarter, July, August, September, third quarter, October, November, December, fourth quarter. So if you have two back-to-back quarters, they have to be touching. They can't be separate. They have to be touching. At least two back-to-back quarters with negative GDP. And remember, we looked at the data. We specifically looked at the data, and we could say we looked at the last full, I think it was 2 years. And there was a very distinctive recession that happened. And that was second quarter, third quarter of 2020. I'm sorry, first quarter, second quarter of 2020. First quarter, we had a negative 5% GDP, so 5% decline by, or GDP declined by 5%. And then we had a 35% decline in GDP for second quarter. And then we had a 30% increase in the third quarter. Now that we had that increase, that meant, by definition, we were no longer in a recession. That doesn't mean that the economy was great and wonderful. It was pretty bad, but using the term definition was incorrect. We were no longer in a recession. Our recession lasted 6 months. Hopefully you will go out and correct people and annoy them, because that's why we take economics, so we can annoy people. This is why I do this for a living. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a whole bunch of quarters, like 2 or 3 years worth of GDP numbers. These are made up numbers. And just to prove they're made up, I think I made them in like 2036 and 2037, which, as you're aware, has not happened yet. So you can't go back and be like, well, I looked at the real data and here was a recession. So I made up the numbers, made up the data, made up the years. And you're going to have to look and identify if and where there was a recession that occurred. That's what that question is going to look like. And if you understand what it looks like, it should jump out at you really, really quickly. So if we have 1 quarter with negative GDP, do we have a recession?
No.
No, we do not. If we have 1 quarter with negative GDP, and then 1 quarter with positive GDP, and then 1 quarter with negative GDP, do we have a recession? No. If we have 1 quarter with positive GDP, 1 quarter with negative GDP, and then 1 quarter with negative GDP, do we have a recession?
Yes.
Yes. We had 1 positive, 2 back-to-back quarters with negative GDP. It's a recession. All right.
Apparently, I struggle to visualize that, but it'll be on paper, so it'll be fine.
Yes. So think of it like this. Let's look at this real quickly. So here's your 4 quarters. Oh, I should do equals here. Okay, so if we have a GDP increase of 1.6%, do we have a recession there? What about, I'm going to make 1 change. What about now? Now we have a recession. Okay. What about now?
It's just a really long recession, right?
That's a really long recession right there. So it's the minimum back-to-back quarters, minimum 2 quarters. You can have more. We haven't seen that since the Great Depression.
How many quarters makes it a depression, or is that just a term for the?
The term depression is not a measurable term.
Okay.
Yeah, depression just means really, really, really bad economy, but it's not measurable. But during the Great Depression, we had 1.5 years of negative GDP.
Wow.
Yeah, that was big. So we had 6 consecutive quarters. Then we had 2 years of positive, and then we had another 6 months of, or another 2 quarters of negative. So we actually had 2 recessions. In the 1970s, we also had 2 recessions in 2 years. 1976, 1977, we had a recession in each one of those years. So, because we had 2 negative back-to-back quarters, and then there was 2 positive quarters, then there was another 2 negative quarters, and then it was positive. So you had 2 recessions in 2 years. But we have not seen more than 6 months of negative GDP since the Great Depression.
I don't remember hearing much about the 1970s recessions. What caused those ones in brief, anyway?
So the brief thing was you had a lot going on. The big thing was the oil prices. So there was a lot of turmoil in the Middle East. You had the what was it? The Saudi Arabia stopped selling the United States oil, so we had a major oil shortage. So the price of oil went really, really high, which drove prices up. You also had kind of a slowing economy. The U.S. was falling behind Japan in technology, so Japan was kind of like the big seller for high tech stuff, and that was when the United States realized, hey, we need to really focus on making high tech stuff because that's where the money is. The 70s were actually a really crappy decade. You had crime almost at its highest level in the entire 20th century. It was in the 1970s. It actually peaked in the 1980s, but the 1970s was right below there, the late 1970s. So you had this weird thing, which we don't get into, but since we talked about, what we're talking about now, you have what's called stagflation, which meant that you had really high inflation. So prices were getting really, really high really quickly, and you had high unemployment. Usually you either have, and we'll talk about this in much more detail later in the class, you either have high unemployment or high inflation. Because generally what high inflation means is that the economy is going too fast. So prices are going up really quickly, but also that means everybody's working. Or you have really high unemployment and low inflation, because high unemployment means people aren't spending that much money because they're not working, so prices aren't rising as quickly. So we had very good solutions for either one of those things. In the 1970s, we had both. And the tools we used to fight inflation cause unemployment. And the tools we use to fight unemployment cause inflation. So that means you can't use either one of these tools, which is, I always describe it as, so this is somewhat personal information, but it's not that bad. So I am allergic to antibiotics. I can't take antibiotics, which means that if I get some kind of infection, we've got to find another way. So that was kind of like me in the 1970s. There was an infection, high unemployment, but we couldn't use the tools we had to fight that, which were antibiotics. So that created also high inflation. It was and there were a number of other things. There were 2 stock market crashes that happened in the 1970s, caused by a lot of speculation in precious metals, gold, silver, and copper. Let's see what else. Basically, if you name, and it's interesting, we don't talk about the 70s much, but economically, it's a very historical decade. Crime was insane. There were, I think the number was, so in 1979, which I think was the second highest murder rate in US history, there were more murders in New York City in 1979 than there were in the entire United States in 2020, or 2019 rather. So New York City had more murders 30 years ago, 40 years ago, just in the city than the entire United States had in 2019. So it was kind of So there's all kinds of interesting stuff. So there's a long drawn out babble about what happened in the 1970s. Fuel was a big thing. And that was, I was young, but I was only 5 or 6. But my parents told me all kinds of fun stories about waiting in line for 2 and 3 hours to go get 5 gallons of gas because they had to limit the amount of gas people could buy. It was kind of crazy. And that was a big thing. So when people talk about how horrible the world is now, you can always find a time in history where it was way, way worse. Usually that answer is the 70s. And then you can throw in there that we just come back from Vietnam and people weren't happy about that. So you also had a lot of economic upheaval, and then you throw in a president who was impeached, Richard Nixon, which throws in more economic upheaval. So nothing we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years is any different than what we've seen before in the 70s and actually in the 80s as well. So yeah, it's the same stuff, just happens over and over again. And we always say the same thing, like, oh, it's the first time. How can we let this happen? Nah, it's happened a bunch of times before, whatever it is that you might be getting into. All right. Questions on GDP? Let's talk unemployment. Yeah, so 1976 started the Arab oil embargo, where most of the Middle Eastern countries would not sell the United States oil. And that was when the United States realized we have to start becoming energy independent. And that's why we had a huge push in the 1980s for energy independence. Also, we were losing market share in technology to Japan. So that's when we realized that we should probably be focusing on the tech industry. So that was it was the 70s were a big turning point for the United States. That's when we focused on energy independence, or started focusing on energy independence and on technology development. And we've done pretty well in both of those. It was also when we started the war on drugs, which didn't turn out so well. Cool. Unemployment. So the key to understanding unemployment is remembering that we're not necessarily talking about, do you have a job or do you not have a job? There are three things. You are either not in the labor force, or you're in the labor force and working, or you are in the labor force not working. If you're not in the labor force, you can still have a job, but we just don't count that towards the unemployment rate. So remember, the unemployment rate is a very specific measurement. So we talked about all those people who are not in the labor force, and there was a whole bunch of them. Remember, there were anybody who's retired, who's not actively seeking work. If you are a full-time student, if you're head of household, remember, they don't use the term head of household, but we're going to use the term head of household. If you are, so what else is there? Full-time military, if you are 15 years or younger, if you're a full-time student, if you are institutionalized. So all those people, whether you have a job or not, doesn't matter, you're not in the labor force. And we went through with this class, and I think we determined that I'm the only one in the class who is in the labor force. Everybody else here is not in the labor force. Some of you are working and some of you are not working, but we don't use those numbers to calculate the unemployment rate. We only focus on the labor force. And you'll see some questions like this. I'll give you an example of a bunch of people, and I'll have you tell me which one is in the labor force, which one is unemployed, which one is employed, things like that. So just be able to identify and read those carefully. Just because you have a job doesn't mean you're in the labor force. Go down that whole little chart that we developed to answer the question. And then to calculate the unemployment rate, we take the number of people in the labor force and we look at what percentage of them is not working. So if it looks like this, let's use a different color here. So if we have 3 people not working, 97 people working, what is our unemployment rate?
3%.
3%, that is correct. Because you've got a total of 100 people in the labor force. 97 plus 3 is 100. If 3 of those are not working, 3 is 3% of 100. There it is. So that's how the unemployment rate is calculated. And you'll have a question like that, unemployment rate calculation. It's going to be easy, base 10. So it's either 100 or 1,000. Because again, I want you to focus on the concept, not on dividing a whole bunch of big numbers. That is unemployment. And how do we define? Who remembers how we define if you are working?
Have worked at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks.
Yes, you worked at least 1 hour in the last 2 weeks, you are employed. So, and understand from this, with the unemployment rate, this is just one number used to analyze the economy. So just because you've got very low unemployment, which is a good thing, low unemployment tends to be a good thing, that doesn't mean that you don't have a lot of people living in poverty, because you can have a job and still live in poverty. So it says nothing about wages. It says nothing about gainful employment. You know, are you making a lot of money? Are you making a little money? Are you working full-time? Are you working part-time? It doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say anything about benefits, things like that. It doesn't say anything about job security. It's simply a way, kind of a brief, you know, tell me in 2 seconds, what's the labor market look like? Unemployment, 6.3%. Okay. And then if you want to really look at what's going on, you can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and just bury your face in data, because they have data on just about anything there. And that's where the real information is. You know, the unemployment rate is great for, you know, I'm going to check the news real quickly, find out what the economy's like. And that's what all of these are. Tell me what GDP is. Tell me what unemployment is. Tell me what inflation is. This is the quick, what's the economy look like? Then you can start digging down, saying, okay, well, unemployment's pretty low. Let's look at other things here. Let's look at which industries are high versus low. Let's look at wages. Let's look at everything. You can look at all these things in depth. So this is the quick, this is kind of like when you go to the doctors, like, all right, we're going to take your temperature. We're going to take your pulse. We're going to take your heart rate. We're going to do height and weight. Now that gives a really quick overview of what your health is, but it doesn't get down the specifics. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We're getting a quick overview of what the health of the economy is without digging into the specifics. And like I said, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which does GDP, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which does inflation and unemployment. If you get a chance, if you like data, check them out there, because you can find all kinds of really good stuff in there. There's some pretty amazing data, which tells a lot better of a story. And if you pursue a career, or not career, but if you pursue an educational career in economics, you'll actually take a full course on just economic indicators. Simply just looking at how we measure the health of the economy and analyzing that data. So we could spend all kinds of time on this. All right, so that is unemployment. Any other questions on unemployment? All right. The last thing we're getting into is inflation. We didn't spend a lot of time on inflation, because this is one of the things that we're going to have to come back to. Because to really truly understand inflation, we're going to have to talk about things like what money is, how we measure the money supply, and how the money supply impacts the economy as a whole. Then we get back to inflation. So for now, we just kind of started with some basic definitions of inflation. If you remember, all we need to know for now is inflation is just a general increase in prices. It's a general increase in prices. And this is why milk used to be a nickel for a gallon, and gas was 12 cents a gallon, and you could pay for college with $300 and all this stuff. Prices go up. And that's what we mean by inflation. You have a general increase in prices. Now, when you're talking about just one product having a change in price, that's not inflation. Inflation is when we take all the products, look at their changes in prices, and we take that average change over time. That's what we mean by inflation. So inflation hits people differently. If inflation, what we're looking at now, inflation is hitting the hardest right now: real estate, gas, and college. So if you are going to school and renting and driving a lot, your prices are the prices that you as an individual are experiencing are going up a whole lot higher than a lot of other people's. So that's which is most of you guys right now. So if you own a house, inflation is not hitting you as much because you're going to have a fixed payment every month for your mortgage. If you don't commute that much, if you don't drive that much, well, you're not too concerned with gas prices. That doesn't impact you too much. If you're not going to school, the increased cost of tuition does not impact you as much. So inflation impacts people differently. And again, that's when you start digging down into the real thing. You start digging down into the data. We can say that, yes, inflation last year was 1.9%. That means on average, prices got 1.9% higher. Well, that's the average. And as we know the meaning of average is that that's not everybody is experiencing an across the board 1.9% increase in their costs. Most of you guys are facing much more than that. You're facing increased gas, increased rent, increased tuition. So it's an interesting way to look at inflation, which is also why you get frustrated with, what do you mean you want to raise? Inflation was only 2% last year. Like, yeah, that was the average. And of course, if you don't get a raise and prices on average go up by 2%, what that means is you really just took a 2% pay cut because everything got expensive, but you're still earning the same amount of money. So that's always something to look into as well. So the only terms you really want to understand for this part of the class until we get deeper into inflation, the only terms you want to understand are nominal prices and real prices. You have a nominal price and a real price. So nominal price, that's that price that you actually paid in the historic year. So when we started looking at what happened to the cost of tuition, we said, all right, well, when I graduated undergrad, I only paid $1,000 a year in 1997. So that doesn't really tell you anything because we're not in 1997 right now. We're in 2021. So what we want to figure out is, no, we're not in 2012. Let's get our numbers right, Adam. We're in 2021. So what you want to figure out is you want to know the real price. You always want to know the real price, meaning that if we take $8,000 in 1997 and we add the rate of inflation to that every single year, what does that equal now? That's how you can start comparing numbers. And you remember we ran through those numbers and it was about 13,500. So what we're saying is $8,000 in 1997 is the equivalent of $13,500 today. The example we used was tuition at NAU. We said, well, the college that I teach in, or the college where I go now, or where I went rather, is now $20,000 a year, which is about what NAU is. So we can say they're about the same price. So we can make the assumption that NAU cost about $8,000 in 1997. I don't know what it cost, but we're going to assume it costs about the same. Meaning now, if it kept up with inflation, tuition should only be $13,500. But it's $20,000, meaning that the price of college has increased significantly faster than the price of, or the rate of inflation. So if your pay is only going up based on the rate of inflation, that means that college is truly more expensive than it was for me. If your pay has not gone up at all in the last few years, that means college is extremely expensive as compared to when I went to school. So that's all you really need to know. So all you really want to focus on is always want to know real prices. Tell me real prices. Nominal prices don't tell you anything. Nominal prices, that's how much you paid in some historical year.
So how did you get 13,500?
So there's a whole mathematical formula behind this that we didn't do. I just went to the, there's an online inflation calculator, and I just typed in $8,000, 1997, what's it worth today? And the reason being is that I'm not going to spend a whole class going over a math problem that you never really need to do because you can type it into the calculator.
So
And
this
really
won't.
all- yeah.
So this won't be on the quiz.
No, I just understand the difference between nominal prices and real prices.
Oh, okay.
That was just the example that I used. And if you Google inflation calculator, there's a ton of them on there, and they're all just what they have programmed in there is the rate of inflation for every year for the last 150 years. So you can see how much if something cost you a certain amount back in the day, how much is that worth today? So if I say, oh, college is cheap, college only costs $1,000 a year. Like, no, Adam, no, boomer. No, Adam, college costs $8,000 a year when you went, but that was last century. That was 24 years ago. We want to know how much it costs now based on what you paid. So I can't say, oh yeah, college is only $8,000. No, well, college was $8,000 in 1997, which is the equivalent today of $13,500. Which means that if college right now, if NAU, and the example I used was NAU, if NAU costs $13,500 a year, well, then we can say, you know what, college has only increased with the inflation rate. So it's right there with the inflation rate, but we know that it has increased considerably more. Questions on inflation? Right, let me do this real quickly. So I'm going to publish your quiz right now. If you understood everything we just went over, you should do really, really well on this quiz. All right, so the quiz is published. It's 10 questions. So this is kind of a weird thing. It's 10 questions. It's not that weird. 4 of them are multiple choice. So I had those set on auto grade. So as soon as you finish, you will have part of your quiz graded. Now this is where things get weird because I have 6 questions I have to manually grade. So you might go through and it'll say that your grade is a 40% out of 100. Don't freak out that you just failed the quiz. What that means is you got the 4 multiple choice questions correct. I just haven't graded the other 6 questions yet. So if you get on there and you're like, it says I only got a 40% and I understood everything. No, you already got the stuff correct. I just have to grade the rest of it. So that's all. Don't want that to take you by surprise. So before you log off, just please jump into Canvas. Make sure you can open the quiz number 3. Feel free to finish it anytime between now and Tuesday by 11:15 a.m. And if you have questions as you're going through it, please feel free to email me. I'm going to stay on if anybody has any questions.